Okay.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Chris. Good evening, everybody, and thanks for joining us for another one of our NEA series for innovative educators. We're so excited. Tonight is going to be a great night, a great 1-hour presentation. My name is Dr. Casey Reason, and I'll be your host, and I am delighted this evening to bring you our presentation called HEARTPRINT from the new book, Heart, by Tim Kanold. And before I begin and talk a little bit about our presentation, I want to first thank our friends and leaders with the NEA. The NEA absolutely has given great leadership in making this happen. If you're not familiar with some of the innovative efforts the NEA is making these days, they're really doing so much to serve educators, teachers, support staff, but they're doing so much to serve educators and advance the profession. And this ongoing webinar, this ongoing series for innovative educators is just one example of free services that we have the NEA has been providing to really expand the profession and expand their service orientation. So thank you for that. I'd like to absolutely give thanks to Brandy Bixler, who can't be here tonight, but Brandy, thank you for the leadership you've provided, and Christopher Thomas is also making this possible, and all the other leaders with the NEA who have made this possible. So thank you for that. So once again, this is, if you're seeing this, if you're an NEA member joining us, welcome. Thank you for being here tonight. If you are somebody that is coming across this, once again, be aware of the leadership the NEA is providing today, really in helping to add to the lives of the students we serve. So this is an amazing presentation tonight. I personally am really excited to be providing or to be supporting you tonight in bringing you the work of Dr. Tim Kanold. This is going to be a really fun and engaging opportunity. So if you haven't been with us in the past, let me explain to you a little bit how tonight's going to work. So we will be together for about 60 minutes, a little less than that by about now. And what we will be doing is, after this introduction, this brief introduction, I'm going to be turning it over to Tim. And Tim is going to give us a presentation about his new book, Heart. And what we'll do is he'll give that presentation. I'll chat with him a little bit after he's done, telling us a little bit about the book and about his presentation tonight and sharing his message with you. And then after that, I'm going to invite all of you who are participating, and we can see some of your faces who are now joining us, and thank you for joining us. But we'll be inviting you to participate. We'll be inviting you to log in and post questions. There's a chat feature that we will invite you to participate. And as those questions come up, we will leave some time at the end for you to ask those. So that's how tonight's going to work. And again, now we know for some of you you're joining us from the various coasts. For those of you joining on the East Coast, we know it's late. So thank you for being here as educators, giving up your time and being here tonight. But it's a real honor to have Tim here tonight. Tim, thank you for joining us. We're gonna turn it over to you for a second, but before I do, for those of you who aren't familiar with Dr. Kanold's work, really an amazing educator. I think he's got all kinds of formality by his name, but first and foremost, he's an amazing teacher. He is an amazing teacher, an amazing mathematics educator. I've read your book, Tim, mathematics educator, and worked at Adlai Stevenson with our mutual friend, Dr. Richard DeFore, and was wound up being the chair or the director of math and science at Adlai Stevenson, and then became the superintendent there. And if you're not familiar with Adlai Stevenson and Dr. Rick DeFore, that's where all of the PLC, the professional learning communities, the great work on PLC spawned from, was that amazing school district. So Tim had a chance to give great leadership there as a math and science director and as a superintendent. And he has since gone on and had an amazing career as a writer and as a consultant. You might have seen him at conferences, and if you haven't had a chance to see him, he's a dynamic presenter. We're so lucky to have him tonight here. And just giving great leadership throughout the years in these really important areas. So Tim, on top of it all, if you haven't had a chance to meet Tim, he's a charming character. He makes everybody he meets feel special and engaged, just like I'm sure you did, Tim, your students. I had the great pleasure of actually being his designated hitter one time. For I think the only time in his long speaking career he was a little bit sick and a little bit under the weather, and they called me in to be the designated hitter a few years ago, Tim. And he rallied and he showed up, so I got to watch him speak again. And so that was a few years ago at the summit, Tim. So
That's true.
I've been a fan of your work. I'm so pleased to have you here joining us. We've been doing this for 3 years, Tim, and you're a huge name in education and innovation and PLCs. And this new book, I'm just so excited for you. I know about it, but I'm so excited for them to hear from you all about this new offering, because I think it gets at the real heart of what this profession is all about. So, Tim, is it okay if I turn it over to you right now and you share with our audience, what you're all about and what this offering is all about?
Absolutely, Casey, and thank you so much for your really kind comments. I do want to say too, just up front, thank you to NEA for actually sponsoring this type of academic interchange, and for the opportunity to showcase certain kinds of books and programs and elements of our professional work that can help us actually grow in our profession. So I'm extremely grateful to be part of this tonight. As Casey mentioned, our focus is going to be, as you can see on my screen, on the screen that you can see, our focus is going to be on this book that I wrote called Heart. And I want to talk a little bit about why I wrote the book and give you some insight into it. One of the things that happened for me is that, hold on one second, Casey, there we go. We have, there we go. It's a long story. I'll tell you later. All right. So here's what happened. I had spent a long career, as Casey mentioned, working with Rick DeFore of PLC fame, one of the original architects. And if you can think of a person in your professional life, regardless of what your role is as an educator, who is your best friend, and both professionally and personally. So that's really quite, there are people that we work with professionally that also become, their families do stuff together, you become friends, you go through a lot of the difficult and the great parts of being an educator together. And so for me, this type of friend sent me this text in the fall of 2014. And the text was, "Are you available for a quick call?" as you can see. And I have to tell you, I laughed at the time because first of all, he had a flip phone, so I wasn't even sure he knew how to text. That kind of surprised me. He wasn't necessarily the most technologically savvy person. But as soon as I was able to call him back, I suspected something was wrong, of course, and there was. His simple message to me was, "I have stage 4 lung cancer. It's not curable. It's just a matter of, how long can I, resist what's going to take place." And so that led us to a conversation. And I have to tell you that for me, that particular person was my friend that you see here on the screen, Rick DeFore. And Rick and I had been through a lot together, and I just felt like he was someone who had made decisions in his life as an educator that had left a distinctive impression, a marked impact on other people, and especially on their hearts. And so I defined this word in the book Heart called HEARTPRINT. And I wanted it to represent the kind of the residue of our work together. What is the impact your heart leaves on your students and your colleagues, regardless of your role in this educational enterprise, the people that are around you that you're working with on a daily basis. Those school seasons stack up. I was telling a group of educators just 2 days ago that 2018, 2019, we're already in late March, so the chances are there's not a lot to salvage to this season. You only have a couple of months left. But the reality is 2019, 2020 could be better, and 2020, 2021 could be even better. And so those seasons become, as they stack up, become your career. And one of the things that we realize in doing that is, what's the impact we're leaving on the people around us? So that was my intent in writing the book, and I wanted to capture some of Rick's thoughts, I think, too, before he passed away. That was one of my goals. And what was interesting about this was the book's really different than what Solution Tree had produced as a book before, and Casey and I had talked about this previously. One of the things is you journal in the book, you write your own professional life story, which is really quite unique. There aren't a lot of books that do that, where they give you space. I call them my heart prints, but I give you the space on margins on both sides to actually intentionally answer certain prompts that come along the way. And because of this, I've been surprised, Casey, actually, but there are a lot of schools that are actually using the book as a book study because of that, because the teachers can write their story and then come together to talk about those elements of their own personal story. along the way, of course, you read some of my stories, and I have to tell you, there are some funny ones and some poignant ones and some difficult ones. For example, there's a story about one of my favorite math teachers of all time. Her name was Mary Lako, and it's in a chapter called What Makes You Weep. There's 33 chapters in the book in 5 parts, which I'll explain in a second. But one of the stories I tell is about the day, December 19th of 2015, when she collapses in front of her students and eventually doesn't make it. Within a week or two, passes away. And this was a teacher who was a tremendous teacher, passed away far too young, but didn't get to name the end of her seasons. And so that story is an important story. It teaches us some life lessons. So that one's more serious, but then there's other really funny stories about when I'm coaching my son's Little League team and my assistant coach was going crazy because his son was pitching. And it's a story that has a point. They always have a point, but a lot of people have written to me and tell me how funny that story was. And then I wanted really for the reader to encounter professional experts inside and outside our profession. What do people like Emma Sepla have to say, and Adam Grant and Daniel Goldman and Tom Rath, all of these experts that normally those of us in the education profession are not going to get to see, interact with. And I think actually I counted them, there's 63 different outside educators whose brief stories or thoughts enter into HEART and provide some insight for us. Sometimes it's research-based insight, like some of the neuroscience behind happiness. Sometimes it's more data that's been collected, for example, by the Gallup organization, and inside information about that. And then ultimately, I wanted to allow the reader to find guidance on how to live a fully formed professional life and feel like when they got to the end of those seasons, they could look back and go, I was awesome. And what would that journey look like? Even recognizing that there are many times when we will fail. And so I think that's really was the intent in writing the book. I had a graduate school advisor, my PhD advisor, who said to me when she read the manuscript for the first time, she said, Tim, it's really important that when you write a book like this, you make sure you take care of the reader. She said, it's one thing for them to hear your stories, but they must find themselves in the book. And I can tell you, I think I mentioned this later on, but it's in my head right now, so I'll just talk about it. I have had more people email me over the last 2 years about chapter 12 than any other chapter. Now, the chapter has an innocuous title. It's called The Quadrant 3 Drift, and that won't make sense to you unless you know what that means once you read the chapter. But people have read that, have written to me about it because it was in that chapter that they found their own story, and then the courage, I think, to change the path of that story. So anyway, that was the intent of writing HEART and why I first took it on in wanting to do it. And then I had this great idea. Oh, every letter of the word HEART would be a different part of the book, and they would all have 7 chapters, and that would just work out great. And so H worked out perfect. I wanted to get into the neuroscience on happiness, talk about the happiness research, and what does it mean for you and I to be happy in the workplace, in the educational workplace. And then E would be for engagement and the percent of us as educators that are actually fully engaged in our work life. I'm like, perfect. All right, that'll be great. A, though, is where it kind of broke down because A is about collaboration and working collaboratively with other peers. And I'm like, oh no, C is not in the word HEART. So it ended up being alliances, which is actually an even stronger word because we form an alliance in order to do what? Solve the complex problems that we face in our profession today. The problems that we're faced with are very complex. So rather than trying to solve them in isolation, we solve them together. So alliance is about that. R is for risk-taking, and in that chapter really is about how to take measured risk so that we don't wear ourselves out, and the risk that we do take has a benefit. And then T is for wisdom, but again, I needed a wisdom word, so it ended up being thought, and that's the 5th part of the book. Having said that, I'm just going to give Casey a brief kind of rundown on these different elements, and then certainly if there are questions or other things that follow up, I'll be glad to respond to those. So the first thing was I was surprised actually to find out that there's a science behind whether or not we present ourselves in a happiness state at work. And Emma Seplow, who you can see in this book, wrote a book called The Happiness Track, and it's an easy read. It's actually one of my favorite books, I think, to recommend, as well as to reread myself for my own journey. But notice the subtitle. It's small print there, but you can see it. How to apply the science of happiness to accelerate your success in life in general. But I loved how she defined happiness. She defines it as a state. Isn't that interesting? A state of being. It's a state of heightened positive emotion. So essentially she's saying, so I'm supposed to go to work every day and be in a state of heightened positive emotion? Yes. I'm supposed to go home with my family and be in a state of heightened positive emotion? Yes. Wow. And I'm supposed to do that every day? Yes. Well, how do I do that is a really good question. And so I've unpacked some of that actually in the first part of my book of Heart. And she says that, look, if we can come to work in this state of heightened positive emotion, it will increase our emotional and social intelligence, and it will boost our productivity and heighten our influence over our peers. So interesting, right? That whole idea of would you want to collaborate with me is partially based on whether or not I come to work in a state of heightened positive emotion. Now, there's a lot more to it, and this is just a sample page from Heart. But here's where I just kind of make this comment about all of your former students and the trail of colleagues, depending on what your role is in the school enterprise, are intersect with the wake of your work life. And your happiness state kind of becomes your reputation in the community over time. And then you can kind of see this left-hand column I was telling you about, where you take time out to actually reflect and write a little bit about your own story and how that looks for you. So this is a very typical looking page, and this was a pretty big deal for us. Even figuring out that we should have lines here on the journal side for people to write with. The thing I want to make really clear, though, to everybody on the call, and even though in this case for tonight, I'm not doing, like a 3-hour seminar on happiness, the one thing I do want to say is that I don't believe that happiness is like some innocent state. That this decision to come to work in a state of heightened positive emotion is a decision I make, but it doesn't mean that there aren't times when life is just really hard, where things aren't going very well. As you can see here, this is actually a blog. Solution Tree has a blog, and this is one of the blog entries that I made on October 9th of just this past year. And it's in response to having had the opportunity to speak at Becky DeFore, Rick's wife's funeral or celebration of life. And what's really hard about this was that her passing away was so sudden. It was so unexpected. And here was this incredible educator, this incredible angel, and just the next thing you know, she's not here anymore for any of us to have the impact that she had on our lives. So for me, I think that this idea of now what do we do now that we've celebrated her life? Now what's next? Is part of the intention of Heart. But it certainly doesn't mean that I'm always in a state of euphoria or innocent happiness, but it does mean that I'm aware that life has these challenges, but I still make the choice to come to work and give you the best of who I am today. Some of you, even on this webinar right now, have maybe had a terrible day. Maybe you've had a really tough year, but the reality is you're still bringing yourself to work every day and doing the best you can to be in a state of heightened positive emotion, even though it's not easy. Because for your students or for your colleagues, that's what will benefit them the most. So I get that. I don't want to pretend that happiness is some nirvana. Which reminds me, I've also discovered a lot of things along the way. For example, there's this idea called Eudaimonia. I'd never heard of it before. I'm a math person, so I don't necessarily live in this world of words like that. But the World Happiness Report that comes out every year, actually in the 2013 report, it's funny, I have the 2016 cover there, but it's the 2013 report that define this idea of eudaimonia, or human flourishing, and notice how they define it here in the words on the screen, a contented state of being. I was like, wow, happy and healthy and prosperous, a contented state of being. So just like Sepala said, it's a state of heightened positive emotion. Happiness is. Eudaimonia is this state of thriving at work. And that allowed me to very nicely move into the second part of the book, which is E for engagement. And the way in which you and I come to work fully engaged in our work life on a daily basis. This is a 2015 report from Hastings and Agarwal, in which they talked about engaged teachers enjoy a personal and professional edge. They kind of experience higher levels of eudaimonia, of thriving. But then they make a very interesting observation that I thought was quite stunning. And they said, left to our own devices, we are most likely to not fully engage in our work life. So I'm like, really? I hadn't thought about that. You know, we're most likely not to fully engage in our work life if we work in isolation, if we work alone. So I think one of the reasons why it's so important to work collaboratively in our workplace culture and create a culture like that is because it will help us to more fully engage. So I have a poll here. We're actually going to try something with the group that's on tonight. We're not quite sure exactly how it's going to work, but I have a poll that I'd like you to take. Just to see what your guess would be. Look at that. Way to go, Chris. Chris is helping us with the setup tonight with our webinar. And the poll is, what % of U.S. teachers, and by the way, when it says teachers, we mean educators, just so you know. That the intent there from Gallup, this is from Gallup's daily tracking poll, is that it's a broader audience. So what % of U.S. educators are fully engaged in their daily work? And if you I'm actually going to vote too. Just make a guess and see if you can vote based on the quick poll that's up there on your screen. Okay. All right. Good luck, everybody. I'll give you like 30 seconds to take a guess of which % you think it is that's fully engaged when they come to work every day. I'm going to guess wrong, just so you know. Okay, what do you think? Are we able to display the results? I don't honestly know if we are or not. Look at you. You're so good. Way to go, Chris. All right, so we've got the majority thinks 45%. That's a pretty good guess. I like that. Well, it turns out that the answer is actually, drum roll, 30%. So it's about 32, 33, 31, somewhere in there, depending on when you actually look at the data. Now, one of the things I didn't do, of course, was to actually define for you what an engaged teacher, how it's defined. But what's really interesting to me is it's defined as educators who constantly look for new and better ways. So I like that. That no matter what our role is, counselor, social worker, support staff member, tutor, teacher, teacher aide, all those different roles we play, administrators, that we constantly look for new and better ways, which is awesome. So we're kind of in a growth mode. We're looking to not rest on our old knowledge. And then to do what? To achieve our outcomes, which is student learning the standards and learning to become good children. So our outcomes are all about the kids in this case, right? So that's how they define it. That it's 30% of us that kind of come to work with this mindset that you see on the screen. Now, I'm not going to get into all the other details about it. You know, that's what, that would be for a different time. But what I can tell you is this is what I was alluding to earlier. What do you believe is a primary cause for the lack of full engagement by educators at work? So this is a question I ask people to write down. Now, there are lots of responses possible. But what I'm really referring to here is whether or not we see it as an outer cause or an inner cause. Is it an outer problem or an inner problem for me? So is it sort of like, well, if this would get better, if that would get better, if that would get better, then I'd be more fully engaged? Or is it more, do I need to balance my own life? Is it more of an inner problem? And in the book, I actually discuss the answer to that. Here's chapter 12, what I was telling you about before, and this idea of avoiding the quadrant 3 drift. Now, quadrant 3 is a high negative energy state when you come to work. And we all drift there, even though we don't mean to. And so in this part of the book, I actually describe ways to avoid the drift. So I'm just going to leave it at that for now, but tell you that that's all part of the E. Now, one of the things that we discover, though, is that I'm more likely to avoid the drift and be fully engaged if I'm in collaboration with you. But to be in collaboration with you, and now the middle part of the book, I've actually got to be willing, I got to like you, and or not like you, but at least be willing to work with you. And we have to be able to form an alliance where we work together, as I mentioned earlier, to solve those complex problems. So what's kind of fun about this part of the book, I think, for me, is why we should collaborate. Why should we pursue a professional learning community culture and process that Casey described earlier? And, and I have to tell you, I think in the beginning, our pursuit of this at Stevenson, of getting all of our educators, all of our teacher educators at any level of the organization to collaborate together, I don't know if it was an inequity issue for us as much as wanting to try to improve performance, and we just saw by working together it would begin to do that. But eventually it became our cause célèbre for erasing inequities in student experiences, in the rigor of the curriculum, in the nature of the standards that students learn, and how they would be assessed about those standards, and how we respond when they're not learning, and responding together, not responding just as individuals. It was, in the end, I think, by working in alliance and collaboration with one another, we begin to erase the happenstance and of, well, which teacher or which school or which place do I happen to go to receive my public school education. And what's really great about this is I think Daniel Kahneman, who you also meet in the book, he won the Nobel Prize for his field of social economics. And Kahneman says that we're a noisy profession. That by noisy he means there's like a huge variance in what a child's experience might be like, depending on which teacher they get for that grade level or in that course. And it's all right to have variances of experiences in terms of I think the way in which I might have my personality and my style work with my students, but it wouldn't be okay for them to learn different standards, or I don't feel like teaching a few standards this year, or to experience widely different rigorous assessments. Those things, that noise needs to be reduced, and that's part of the key of working together in a professional learning community, identifying what that noise is, and then working together as educators to help kind of neutralize that noise. And so one of the chapters actually in this part of the book is called, "Oh, the Inequity Places Will Go." It's funny, if two things about this one. One, the quote that you see, the epigraph quoting Martin Luther King Jr., is the reason I got in the profession. But when I really look at my why, I think this would be it. I just felt like I could help create a better day. That we ought to be better than we currently were in my school, and I wanted to do something about that, and so that we don't have to be held hostage to the isness of this moment. We could work together and row the boat together to actually improve student learning in our school. At the same time, just on a more humorous side, a gentleman came up to me last week when I was doing a workshop on heart, and actually said to me, he goes, "I'm so disappointed with chapter 17. And I'm like, "Why? Please tell me." And he said, "Well, it starts out with this great kind of Dr. Seuss feeling, and then nothing in the rest of the chapter actually rhymed. I was really hoping to get a rhyme." So just a fair warning, I'm not Dr. Seuss. But I thought that was a funny title, which happens quite a bit in different parts of the book. me thinking there's funny titles. And here's actually Daniel Kahneman, that's who I was talking about, who talked about this noisiness of our profession and working hard to begin to neutralize that noise. And then I also do provide some insight into the factors of social intelligence. How can our team, how can we as individuals be considered more intelligent in the work that we do? And so that's kind of fun. There's actually these 4 factors of emotional intelligence. Again, I don't want to get into them all here. That would take up too much time. But I actually have you reflect on these 4 factors, and once they're explained, and then, you know, which ones present your greatest challenge and my greatest challenge, and so on. So it's pretty cool. That's really a lot. People tend to have a lot of fun with that one. Now, ultimately, as we work together, any, I think, successful organization or school culture is definitely going to be a risk-taking culture. We're going to experiment. We're going to try things. We're going to see if they work, and if they don't work, we're going to rethink it and try again. We're going to continually look for ways to improve student learning. So I call this the risk vision dependency, and this is just one chapter, but that we don't risk anything. We risk things that are based on the vision of what we want to become. What's our vision for intervention? What's our vision for instruction? What's our vision for assessment? And then we'll risk things that we believe at least will advance that vision. That's the idea, at least. And so because of that, I have a couple of chapters here that really spell out how guideposts, if you want to think of it that way, for risk-taking that can be successful. And then I also make it clear, and I think this is really important, that the only antidote that I know of, like, here's the thing. If you make a decision to be a school culture of continuous improvement, then you have made a decision for the rest of your life that you will never be good enough. You won't be, your team won't be, your school won't be. We will relentlessly try to improve. I have often told the story of the year that I was one of the years that I was director of math and science at Stevenson, Casey mentioned that job, in which I went to Rick for the "Are you available for a quick call" guy, and said, I am tired of improving. This year we're going to be just as good as we were last year. And he said, well, sorry, Tim, that's not good enough. The reality is the only antidote that I know of to always having to get better is to celebrate. Celebrate every Friday. Celebrate every month, celebrate every year, and celebrate through stories of identity, stories that show the humanity of the work we did, stories that show the impact, even one weekend. You know, my favorite interview question of anyone that we're going to hire is in education, in our educational world. My number one favorite question is this: if we give you this job, at the end of September, what will you show me? What evidence will you produce? Will you show me that you are having a great year, that you are having a successful year? What is the story you will tell me, the stories you will tell me to illustrate that things are getting better, things are improving? It's a really tough question, but I really like it because I think that, you know, to some extent, it's really important that we tell stories, and that's why Heart is kind of built on a story basis. And finally, the very last part of the book, T, is for thought. And I want to tell you this. I thought long and hard about this last part of the book being in the first part of the book. That if I started a book on happiness, people would be like, really? This kind of soft topic, even if it has neuroscience behind it? Where's the stuff we're supposed to know for our profession? What's in our wisdom bucket? And here's what I've come to realize over the years is that if these other things are not in place, if I don't bring myself into a happiness state at work, if I don't fully engage, if I don't collaborate, if I'm not willing to have a growth or risk-taking mindset, then I could have all the wisdom in the world, and it will not make me a great educator. It will always hamper and limit what could be a knock your socks off career. So those things are necessary. Now, all those things can be great, but without wisdom around really important issues, then that could be a problem. we do want to have wisdom about the right things. So in the last part of the book, I actually have a chapter called Your Voice of Wisdom. And you have to actually figure out what that is for you personally. And I also tell you what it is for me. All right, so that's kind of a quick outline. I think that this was my intent in designing the book. And I just want to share this last little bit with you, and then we'll get into a give and take or Q&A. So this slide that you see here, not really the whole slide, you see chapter 33. It's the last chapter of the book. I was writing it as Rick is, 3 weeks from passing away. And his last slide that he would use was this quote that you see from Miriam Wright Edelman, that justice is not divisible, that we should treat our students as if they were our own children. And I have to tell you, I don't know if I always won that way. I don't know if I always fought for other people's children to the same extent that I fought for my own children, right? But I do believe that that's the goal. That's part of the hope of improving our American educational system, is that as the stewards of their learning, over those 13 years they come to public school, that we will do that. And so I share in this part of the book kind of Rick's final message and his final words. So with that, Casey, I'm going to stop and let you take it away for a little bit. Oh.
Sorry about that, Timmy. I was still muted for a second there. Chris was wisely keeping me quiet while you were giving us your words there, so I wouldn't interrupt you. But thank you so much for sharing that, and I'm just so glad, frankly, we have the technology to not only hear your words, but to really feel your words. And again, for those of you who are seeing Tim for the first time, you can feel the heart and authenticity. What you're sharing is, there's science behind it, and there's lots of thoughtful wisdom, but what's the biggest hindrance why is this so hard for us?
I think we have a colleague, Casey, that Tim Brown, right? Mm-hmm. And when Tim gives his keynote address at our big events, our big PLC events, he often challenges the audience to reconnect to the teacher they wanted to be, or the educator they wanted to be when they first took on that job, no matter what that job is, right? And remember that passion and that insight that you had at that stage of your life. I think what happens very naturally to all of us is there is in our profession a tendency to be devalued or to feel beaten down, or to get hardened because of that. I've seen that child before. I've seen that problem before. I'm just really tired of dealing with it. Or doing incredible work, but rarely is it validated or appreciated, whether it's by the community or other people within your school community. And I think that, quite frankly, I remember when I got to Stevenson. I can say this publicly. I tell the story anyway in heart. After I took the job, Rick told me, and my job was to be the director of math and science. Rick told me, he said, well, just so you know, this is culturally the most difficult group of people we have in our school and in our district. And you're going to have to figure out how to interact with those folks. But when I examined, I think, why they felt they were that way, I think a lot of it was because they just had so many years of not being appreciated and not feeling validated by their work in terms of results. And so one of the things I started to do, which is really funny looking back on it now, and it was, for me, it was natural. And I think different people have to decide what works for them. So for me, I started, every time I sent you a note of any kind, I always put a smiley face at the end of it. I still do it today. And that's one thing. Another thing was, I made a point of catching people being good, which isn't often is misunderstood. Well, you're supposed to be good, so why would I verbally reward you for actually doing something you were supposed to be doing anyway? But the reality is, you have to be willing to notice. I think everyone has to say in the culture, we're coming together to take care of one another. So we're going to notice each other's effort. We're going to celebrate each other's work. Part of compassion is my ability to celebrate your success. But I got to tell you, that's a really difficult thing to do. In fact, I struggled to celebrate the success of my colleagues early on in my career because it wasn't my success. Mm-hmm. And so I think I was jealous. I kind of was like, oh, they're so successful and I'm not getting any credit here. And, versus just being happy for them that we had a victory with some children, with some students. So the last thing I'll just say about it is the second thing I did, which I actually got in trouble for. And again, this story is also in Heart. But I got called in by the school board president, and he wanted to know what this line item, I had a line item for $1,700 in my budget. And the line item title was cake. And the school board president says, Tim, what's this line item for cake? He says, you're spending $1,700 on cake? And I said, well, it's not always cake. Sometimes it's cupcakes or donuts. It's not always cake. And he said, well, what for? And I said, well, because every Friday we look for a victory somewhere in our division. With we could, maybe for the first time, we finally got students to do a particular lab. All right, we're going to have cake and celebrate that team's effort or that teacher's effort even. And so that became a big deal, that the Friday celebration and which groups were we celebrating. And I not only would I bring the cake or donuts, whatever, but I'd write up a little paragraph and we would, give that to you, paste it into this like folder thing. And so that way you could collect those over time. So I think we just don't do enough of that. That's part of the point. By the way, my lesson learned on the cake budget line item was don't always title a budget line item exactly what it's for. Yeah, I could have probably just said supplies. But
that is wise counsel for sure, Tim. And now the truth is out for those of you listening. Now, Tim, I thought those smiley faces were just for me. I thought now that I know you give it to everybody, you kind of gave it away there. But let me ask you something about, because so many of this teachers and educators today feel such frustration and they want to feel heart-based in what they do, but so much of what I've heard them talk about is, geez, I just feel so beaten down by the system. The system will overwhelm me with bureaucracy. In fact, one of the things our colleague Rick and I wrote about this, and I've written about it, and the whole notion of this factory mentality that drives our schools, that that really with the formation of our schools, a factory model of keeping everybody the same. And sort of this oppressive notion that I'm convinced is still alive in schools today. And, no matter how hard we try, Tim, it's probably in our lifetime, we're probably not going to ever totally see that removed from schools. So as schools continue to face these sort of, at times, sort of oppressive old mental models of keeping everybody the same, and that doesn't allow the expression of that heart. And you hear so many educators sort of wanting that, but feeling that sometimes ominous pressure from their school, and what, intended or not. How do we empower our educators to face those systems at times that, again, are maybe well intended, but are really trying to keep people in boxes and yet still be heart-based? It's such a struggle for so many that I meet. What counsel do you have about that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think as you were talking, it's actually funny you say this, because Heart's an interesting book in its subtle complexities. And there's a reason actually that you go from those first two components about happiness and engagement, which are very personal decisions, to collaboration, which is a very much of okay, how do we begin to create a collaborative culture that's effective, where we begin to own our decisions. Because the only way to get around that is to allow those closest to the fire, the people closest to the heat, the people in the action in the classrooms, to own their own learning. And so when we think about test construction or labs and projects and methods of grading and so on, yes, there's research that informs us on how to do that. But we have to ultimately allow the team to make good decisions. Now, you don't just allow the team to make any kind of decisions, but to make good decisions based on what we know is best for student learning. And so that when you look at allowing for this ownership of the different aspects of our workload, right? It should be built on the principle that's actually the next part of the book, which is risk taking. So that's what's really interesting to me, because you see, if we say that we're going to become a great organization, school organization, then we have to be about constantly improving and this risk-taking notion, which means you won't settle on your old paradigms. You would never do that. Mm-hmm. In fact, I think one of the most dangerous things that we can allow in any school culture is, well, that's just how we do it around here. That would be death at Stevenson. That would never have been tolerated. And Rick would never have tolerated it. I certainly would not have tolerated it. That if our answer to anything, whether good or bad, is that that's how we've always done it, then we're in trouble. Mm. The answer to asking, is that still the best way to do it, might be yes, but it could also probably, and most probably will be no. There are ways of improving it. And so what you described is for lack of a better term for me, I have a chapter on entropy in the book. And it's this kind of sick kind of where the weeds just come in and take over, because we're not being careful to allow ourselves to continue to look for ways to move forward. And so what happens is we don't pay attention to what's going on in the culture. And so I think that's kind of philosophical, but the reality is we are now seeing a lot of schools where I think all the adults, not us versus them, and I've been on both sides of it. I've been on the union side, and I've also been, superintendent of a school district. Ultimately, in the best school systems, I think there's this blurring of administrative, teacher, and faculty roles that we all are in the enterprise together, and everyone has equal value no matter what their role is. How do we help maximize that value in that role? And all, I think that's really the goal, and that's probably a little bit of what you guys wrote about, correct?
Absolutely, yeah. And what I love so much about your message too, Tim, is that you're sending the message. And correct me if I'm wrong. I don't want to misinterpret it, but we own our journey. I mean, we at the end of the day, no matter what happens, we own our journey, and what happens to us, we can't always control, but the meaning that we ascribe to the things that happen to us and around us is everything. And so, meaning making, the thought, arguably the thought part of your model, that's something that I've actually been in rooms with educators, and when they realize that they're in charge of their journey, that while they may be given a schedule and be given preps, that they're in charge of their journey, how they think of it, how they attach to kids. At times we remind each other, because we can all get so overwhelmed by the have-tos or whatever else, but we own our journey, don't we?
Well, and I have to admit, there are certain more global conditions that sometimes are out of your control. Mm-hmm. For example, neither Rick or I have ever been a big fan of merit pay systems or state assessments or things like that. We really believe that the local school unit really needs to control the quality of their work, and that if you take care of that, everything else will take care of itself. And certainly sometimes we can feel there can be abuses to how time allotted to do professional work is used. But I think, Casey, it is a journey. Yeah, no system that I know of is perfect. But what I do know is here it is, because I was thinking about this earlier, but I didn't know how to quite say it to answer your question. I think a coherence builder for a lot of schools that are trying to shift their culture off of that old paradigm of institutionalized kind of top-down management approach is to dig in and allow yourself some freedom for the rest of your life to answer with fidelity the 4 critical questions of a professional learning community. And so, yeah, you're nodding because you know what I'm talking about. Sure. Number 1, what do we want every child to know and be able to do? And that will happen. Access, that's why it's an equity issue. Access to that curriculum of what we want them to know and be able to do, whether that's a curriculum that's a knowledge base or a pedagogical issue. We will all come together as a teacher team, as a grade level team, as a school, and agree these are our standards. This is what kids are going to learn. 2, how do we know if they know it? That's all the assessments we give. And working together, again, the collaborative team working to answer those questions allows them then to own that. And and then what's our response when kids aren't learning? And not what's my response. I spent 12 years teaching, and I'm the only one that had a response when kids weren't learning.
Right.
So what? They're going to get a better learning experience than the kids that happen to have the teacher next door? Well, that shouldn't be the case. That's an inequity. And the answer isn't, Tim, stop giving kids really good interventions. The answer was work together with your colleagues to create to create an answer to what will be our response when kids aren't learning. How do we help them learn? So I get it. I think if we can do that, the 4th question is, as you know, is what's our response if they are learning? Mm-hmm. So when you decide to answer those 4 questions, I think your culture begins to shift.
Well, the pronoun shift, you've seen it, and those of you who are the educators are listening, but the pronoun shift from my students to our students, it represents such a significant change, because not only are we serving students more comprehensively, but we feel differently. Human beings are tribal. We're a tribal species, and we feel a lot better when we've got a tribe to depend on. And I think it really does feel different to ourselves at the cellular level when we're at that level. But I want to touch on that celebration piece a little bit more. When I was a young principal, Tim, I was so obsessed with results. I probably drove people crazy, and I did not get the celebration memo enough because I was so busy driving. And we got some good results, but I think I gave everybody gray hair and myself along the way. But celebration it's such an emotional thing. It becomes the reason we don't have these seminars on Wednesday nights, because so many of our colleagues are at church Wednesday nights. There are ceremonies, there are traditions, there are habits that we have, where things that we celebrate that make us feel so human. And I think you're right. And I'll put myself out there, especially earlier in my career, I did a lousy job of buying the cake. I didn't have that line item, Tim, and I should have done more of that. I look back now, and I had such wonderful colleagues, and we celebrated each other in our own way, but it's such a better way to be. I want more words of wisdom on that, Tim. Tell me a little bit more about what that can do to a culture, because I just love that part of your message.
Yeah, I kind of glossed through it, but for us, it was telling the story. That the best celebrations, whether they're public or private, have a story component to them. This ability to kind of set the scene. Who are the players? What's the barriers they overcame? And what was the victory? Kind of those components. And early on at Stevenson, one of the things that we started to do, and believe it or not, we actually stole this idea from an elementary school celebration that we saw in North Carolina. So that's the best part, sometimes. But one of the things that we decided to do was 3 times a year, we would give out these what we called Super Pad Awards. And it's not so much the award that's really important. Here's what's important to know. It's the way we gave them out. So I think when you look at celebration, it has to be celebrating the human element, not celebrating just some passage of time. So for example, there would be, we had a teacher team one time that had a colleague. It's when I kind of knew our collaboration was working. They had a colleague who had breast cancer and was out for about 5 months. But while she was gone, they graded all of her exams for her. They would occasionally go in and teach her class, even though a sub was there at critical times. They would do all of her students' grades for her. They just took care of the class. So when she came back, she would not have to be worried about, are they behind? Do I have all this catch up to do? What would I have to do? When we read that story publicly, we talked about, here, and here's the key. You don't name the recipients till the end. When you tell the story of identity, you kind of leave out the who part until the very end. And so Rick or Dan or whoever we had doing it would get up on the stage and say, describe the situation. Here's what happened. because of these 4 teachers' heroic work, this teacher, was able to come back, explain the barrier that they overcame because of the difficulty of losing this teacher for the 5 months, and her own journey. And then at the very end, and everybody's sitting there going, well, which team is this for sure? They didn't necessarily know. And at the very end, he names the teachers, standing ovation. The teacher with cancer comes up to the front. She's in tears. The whole place is giving her, it created this emotional moment. And I think you have to be intentional about things like that. That's the point. Celebration isn't happenstance, I think.
Right.
But it can't be intentional like it's a job. It can't be intentional it has to be intentional but authentic. Yeah, which, so it's not, oh yeah, it's May, we got to do some celebrating. Let's find some people to celebrate. It can't be like that. It's got to be.
Yeah, it can't be routinized. It's got to be more authentic, and it's
exactly. Right, absolutely. And so, I think and I used to be like, oh gosh, but what if we miss somebody, or what if, someone's feelings are hurt, and that's actually what they call the tall poppy syndrome, where you hammer down the taller poppies or cut them off so that everyone stays the same. And our attitude was, let's just make taller poppies,
totally.
So that and if you do miss somebody, then you say, okay, we'll catch you next time. Sorry we didn't, whatever our method we used to gather that data wasn't sufficient for at least this particular time. And so I think you have to be, I don't know if this is an actual phrase I read somewhere. It sounds to me like something Douglas Reeves would have said, but it's something about your noticing quotient. You have to be willing to notice what people are doing and then celebrate it in an authentic way.
Wow, that's powerful. That's powerful. And for those of you that are listening, we'll have a few minutes at the end. If you want to post any questions for Tim, we'd be happy to respond to those. Tim, I've always, I love your thoughts on stories, and post them now, by the way, so we can get to you. But I've always, the idea of stories, I think, is really important. I've always felt that you could tell a lot. A very qualitative way of looking at a school culture is if you can go into a school and listen to the stories that are told, and frankly, they can be the same event, but how they choose to position that story, and what they articulate about that story, whether they're the victim in the story, or whether they're the hero in the story, or whether they're, that was somebody else's responsibility. I think you can listen to stories and learn a lot about a school culture and about, how it needs to grow. As you think about that, with schools you've worked with that have been successful, what kind of storytellers have they been?
Well, I think that as you were talking, I think the successful schools, I have a couple of chapters in the book on hope. And when you and I come to work, we're either hope providers or we're not. And when you're a hope provider, you do not tell victim stories. You do not blame they. You won't see they in the culture at all. You won't see people say, well, they won't let us do that, or they this, or they that. And I challenge that. If I do hear you talking that way, where you say they, these students, they, or these teachers, or these administrators, or whoever's speaking, I'll be like, exactly who? I'll make you name the names of the they. Because otherwise it's a cop-out, and I'm a victim. They're just not, So I look for that, and I look for whether or not you're a hope provider. Do you provide direction? Does your story provide a sense of ownership? Does your story provide, that mirror window concept? So do you look out the window and does your story give other people credit for the success that's going on? And if things are struggling, does your story look inward and say, all right, yeah, we are struggling with this, but here's what I'm trying to do to make it better. I love those. And so that's what I look for. And so you're either a hope provider or you're a victim. You're acting like a victim. And so I look to see if the stories you're telling fall into one of those two categories, and then help you recognize it.
Well, Tim, you've been part of the amazing story of Adley Stevenson. You've been a part of an amazing story of so many educators' lives. And for those of you that are listening now, I really hope that you've had a chance to get a really good flavor for this work, for what's possible. And I really hope, even if you don't buy the book, and I hope you do, but I hope that you take the message. We hope that you carry the message, because it's leading with heart, and from the classroom, making an impact on kids and those you serve. This is all of our one chance to do this, Tim, right? This is our one chance to do this. And so we need to absolutely make the most of it. So Tim, you've given generously. You're on the road, and people value your time, and we value your time. So thanks so much for sharing with this really innovative group. We're going to push this out and share your good thoughts with lots of our friends. But thanks so much tonight for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Casey and Chris. Yeah. And thanks so much to NEA too for inviting me on. It was a pleasure for me to do this with you tonight, Casey. Thanks so much.
Well, the next time I see you will be, Tim, it'll be too long. So I'm looking forward to seeing you again, my friend. And again, thanks so much for joining us, and to be continued, my friend.
Thanks. Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thanks again. All right. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Chris.